The small town of Oak Ridge, nestled in the rolling hills of the Midwest, had always been a place where life moved slowly. People knew each other by name, and the rhythm of daily life was set by the changing of seasons and the hum of local news. It was a place where everyone had their roles: the baker, the librarian, the town judge, and Maya Jackson, who was known for her quiet nature, hard work, and determination. Maya, a woman in her early 30s, had always been someone who kept to herself. She was respected in her community, not for flashy accomplishments, but for her consistency and grace under pressure. She worked 2 jobs, one as a receptionist at the local law office and the other as a part-time trainer at the gym, always with a warm smile and a quiet strength. But the thing no one knew was that Maya had a secret. She was training to be an Olympic sprinter. The town's judge, Frank Mitchell, was a man of the law, known for his firm but fair decisions. He believed in maintaining order and upholding justice, even if it meant dealing out heavy fines for small infractions. One chilly morning, Maya was caught speeding through a residential street on her way to a pre-dawn practice. The fine was small, but the community couldn't help but gossip about it. Maya Jackson, of all people, they whispered, caught breaking the law. It seemed out of character, yet it wasn't the fine that concerned them. It was what the fine represented: the cracking of a perfect facade, a glimpse behind the curtain into a side of Maya they hadn't imagined. As Judge Mitchell issued the fine, he didn't think much of it. He had no idea that Maya had been quietly preparing for something far greater than any of them realized. In fact, to him, she was just another local woman who had made a careless mistake. However, what the judge didn't understand was that Maya's ambition was not easily deterred. Though the fine seemed like a small blip on the radar of Oak Ridge's daily life, Maya's response was anything but passive. She wasn't angry about the fine, nor was she looking for sympathy. Maya knew what it took to overcome challenges. What she was determined to prove was that she could rise above not just this minor setback, but anything that came her way. The fine would not define her. As the town discussed the incident in hushed tones, Maya quietly returned to her training, running every morning before the sun came up. She did not need the validation of the community, nor did she seek revenge for what was, in her mind, just a small inconvenience. But what the judge, and everyone in Oak Ridge, didn't realize was that Maya was about to do something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. And as the weeks passed, whispers began to spread not just about the fine, but about her athleticism. People who had once seen her only as the quiet woman working 2 jobs now began to hear about her surprising feats in local races. Her name started circulating among coaches, and soon the quiet runner was becoming someone to watch. But the real story was still unfolding, one that would soon captivate the entire nation, starting with the very fine that had been meant to hold her back. Maya Jackson had always been more than what her small town saw. She was more than the receptionist at the law office or the friendly trainer at the local gym. She wasn't just a woman who lived a quiet life, keeping her head down, doing the work. Maya had a burning ambition, a passion that had been nurtured since she was a young girl. It wasn't something she had ever openly shared with others, for fear of ridicule or judgment. People in Oak Ridge knew her as the quiet, hard-working woman who simply didn't seem to make waves. What they didn't know was that, in the early mornings before anyone was awake, she was running. Each day before the first rays of sunlight hit the town, Maya was already out on the old track at the edge of Oak Ridge, pushing herself to the limit. It wasn't a grand track, nor was it filled with crowds of cheering fans. It was a simple, worn-down place that only the most dedicated runners ever saw. But to Maya, it was everything. It was where she could dream of something bigger than the life she had known, where every stride brought her closer to the Olympic trials she secretly hoped to one day compete in. Her training was intense, mornings filled with sprints, interval workouts, and long-distance runs that tested her endurance. She would run in the rain, in the wind, and on the hottest days of summer, always with the same goal in mind: to qualify for the Olympic Games. Maya had been running competitively since high school, But it wasn't until a few years ago that she decided to push herself to the highest level. She had heard whispers about the Olympic trials, watched athletes from around the world chase their dreams, and realized that she had the talent to be among them. Her journey, however, was not easy. She had no sponsors, no professional coach, and no team to back her up. She trained alone, often running after long shifts at the gym. Exhausted but determined. Her family, while supportive, didn't fully understand the gravity of her dream. They saw her as the responsible daughter, the one who always took care of things, never the one to chase such an ambitious goal. Her friends thought she was crazy to think she could make it, and that added another layer of silence to her pursuit. She kept her goals to herself, not out of shame, but out of the belief that dreams like hers were often dismissed as unrealistic for someone like her. But Maya wasn't discouraged. Every sprint, every lap, and every grueling session on that track was a step closer to something greater. Her talent was undeniable. Though she was quiet, unassuming, her speed on the track was electric. In local races, her times were beginning to turn heads. Coaches from nearby cities took notice, offering encouragement and tips, though Maya never shared her ultimate goal. She simply ran, pushed herself harder with each passing day, knowing that one day the world would know who she was. The fine, though frustrating, hadn't deterred Maya. In fact, it became a symbol of something much deeper, her determination not to be held back. While others saw the fine as a simple penalty, Maya saw it as a challenge she would rise above. It wasn't just the fine that would define her, but how she responded to it. And in that quiet town, on that lonely track, she was silently, fiercely, chasing the dream that had always lived inside her heart. As Maya continued her quiet journey toward Olympic glory, life in Oak Ridge carried on. The fine, which had stirred the town briefly, began to fade from public discussion. Most people returned to their routines, only remembering the fine when it was mentioned in passing. But for one person, Maya's story was just beginning to unfold. David Carter, a young reporter for the Oak Ridge Gazette, was always on the lookout for stories that would capture the attention of the small town's readers. He had only been working at the paper for a few months, trying to prove himself in the world of journalism. He had covered the usual fare, town meetings, local events, and the occasional high school football game. But the stories that stuck with him were the ones that were deeper, more meaningful. That's when he stumbled upon Maya's name, buried in a small blurb about a speeding fine. At first, David didn't think much of it. After all, Maya Jackson was hardly a headline grabber. But as he read through the details of her case, something piqued his interest. There was no mention of Maya's background, no personal details, just the straightforward legal matter of a fine for speeding. Yet something about the brief mention left a lingering question in his mind. Who was Maya Jackson? And why did the fine seem to be more than just a routine case? David couldn't shake the curiosity that began to grow. His instincts told him there was more to Maya than met the eye, and he made it his mission to uncover her story. He began with the basics, reaching out to people who knew her in town. To his surprise, many spoke of her quietly with admiration. She was known for being hardworking and friendly, but not much more was said. Intrigued, David decided to dig deeper. He knew Maya trained at the local gym. So he visited one afternoon under the guise of doing a routine feature on the town's fitness scene. When he met Maya, he was struck by her quiet confidence. She wasn't flamboyant or looking for attention, but there was something undeniably compelling about her presence. "Mind if I ask you a few questions for an article?" David asked as he introduced himself. Maya hesitated but agreed. Sitting with him after her training session, he asked about her daily routine, her work, and what she enjoyed doing in her free time. It was during this conversation that Maya mentioned her training runs, almost in passing, without revealing the depth of her commitment. "I run every morning, before work," she said, glancing down at the floor. "It's just something I do to stay in shape." David sensed there was more to this simple statement, but he didn't press her. Instead, he asked if she ever participated in any local races. Maya shrugged, as if the thought was unremarkable. "I've done a few, nothing serious," she said, her voice betraying the modesty of someone who didn't seek recognition. But David was not easily deterred. After their conversation, he dug into local athletic records and discovered that Maya had consistently placed in the top ranks of regional races for the past few years, and her times were improving dramatically. His curiosity grew, and a pattern began to emerge. A quiet but determined woman, training in the shadows, not for local victories, but for something far grander. David's mind raced as he pieced together the information. Maya Jackson wasn't just a local runner. She was a contender, someone capable of making waves in the Olympic trials. His heart quickened at the thought. Oak Ridge, a town that had always remained under the radar, was on the brink of witnessing a remarkable story of persistence, and David knew he had stumbled upon something far greater than a simple local article. This was the story of a woman defying all odds. Excited by the discovery, David made it his mission to get to the bottom of Maya's story, knowing that the world would soon learn about the quiet champion who had been hiding in plain sight. And as he began to gather more information, it became clear that this was only the beginning of something extraordinary. The quiet town of Oak Ridge was beginning to buzz with a newfound sense of excitement, though few could pinpoint exactly why. It wasn't the usual source of gossip, the high school play, the fall festival, or even the latest football game. This time, it was something deeper, more mysterious, something the town hadn't expected. Maya Jackson, the quiet, hard-working woman who had always flown under the radar, was about to become a local hero. David Carter, having pieced together the truth about Maya's secret training and athletic prowess, had been waiting for the right moment to break the story. He knew that if he went public with it too soon, it could draw unwanted attention to Maya, attention she wasn't ready for. But as the Olympic trials grew closer, David realized the time had come to reveal her journey to the world. The story ran on the front page of the Oak Ridge Gazette one chilly morning in late spring, with the headline, "Oak Ridge's Hidden Champion, Maya Jackson's Journey to the Olympic Trials." The article detailed her rise as a sprinter, her dedication to her training, and her pursuit of a dream that few knew she had. It was a story of perseverance, hard work, and the quiet strength of a woman who had always been underestimated. The article didn't shy away from the obstacles Maya had faced, how she had kept her athletic ambitions a secret, knowing that people in the town would never believe someone like her could make it to the Olympics. It also touched on the fine she had received for speeding, framing it as a turning point in her journey. David framed it not as a negative moment, but as a catalyst that forced people to pay attention. Maya wasn't going to let a minor setback hold her back, and that made her story even more compelling. As the article hit the newsstands, the reaction was swift and intense. The town of Oak Ridge, still grappling with its perception of Maya, began to buzz with excitement. People who had once seen her as just the receptionist or just the trainer began to view her in a new light. They began to realize that this woman they had underestimated had been quietly building towards something extraordinary. Some were shocked. They hadn't known Maya had any athletic aspirations beyond the occasional jog or gym session. Others were proud, eager to see one of their own rise to such heights. Word spread quickly, and soon Maya's name was being discussed in local coffee shops, over dinner tables, and in the aisles of the local grocery store. Maya, meanwhile, tried to keep her life as normal as possible. She wasn't interested in the attention. Her focus remained on the Olympics. She had always kept her dream a secret, and now, with the story out in the open, there was a part of her that felt exposed. But there was another part of her, the part that had been training alone in the early hours of the morning for years, that felt a surge of determination. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. As the days passed, the town rallied behind Maya. Supporters reached out, sending her encouraging messages, offering to help with anything she needed. Her friends, who had always known about her talent but never truly understood the extent of her ambition, began to see her in a new light. They saw not just the woman they had always known, but the champion she was becoming. But it wasn't just the town that took notice. The article reached far beyond Oak Ridge, catching the attention of sports outlets, coaches, and even a few Olympic scouts. The quiet woman who had been running alone in the shadows was now on the radar of people who had the power to shape her future. Maya, however, remained grounded. She wasn't in this for the fame or recognition. She was in it for herself, for the dream that had been burning inside her for years. And now, as the world began to learn of her story, she knew that the journey was far from over. The path to the Olympics was still ahead of her, and the real test was just about to begin. But for the first time, Maya Jackson didn't feel like she was running alone. As the days passed, the story of Maya Jackson's rise to Olympic trials continued to reverberate through Oak Ridge. Her name was now a topic of conversation on every street corner, at every table, and even in the offices where people had once dismissed her as just another small-town woman. Yet, not everyone was celebrating her success. The one person who couldn't escape the weight of her newfound fame was Judge Frank Mitchell. Judge Mitchell had always prided himself on making fair and just decisions. He saw himself as a guardian of the law, someone who upheld the rules without bias. The fine he had imposed on Maya for her speeding violation had been, in his eyes, a simple matter, an ordinary transaction between the law and an infraction. He had no idea that his small action would end up shaping the course of Maya's life, propelling her into the spotlight in a way that neither of them could have predicted. As the story of Maya's athleticism became public, Frank found himself tangled in the consequences of his earlier decision. At first, he tried to ignore the growing buzz around her, focusing instead on his work. But over the weeks, the constant mentions of Maya in the local media and in conversations around town began to weigh heavily on him. People were talking about her in a way that left him feeling uneasy. Frank had always believed in the idea of punishment fitting the crime, yet seeing Maya's story unfold had forced him to question his own actions. He hadn't thought much about the fine when he handed it down. Just another case, another rule enforced. He'd seen hundreds of such cases before, where people paid a fine and moved on. But Maya was different. She wasn't just a local resident. She was someone with an extraordinary story, a story he had unknowingly triggered. The more he thought about it, the more guilt crept in. Had his fine been the push he needed to gain the attention she deserved, or had it been an unnecessary burden placed on someone already struggling to stay afloat? The question gnawed at him, and for the first time in years, Frank found himself questioning his own judgment. In his mind, the fine had been a trivial matter, but now, it seemed like the spark that ignited something much bigger. Frank wasn't the type to dwell on past decisions. He had always taken pride in moving forward, in making his rulings with confidence. But the way Maya's story had unfolded had given him pause. Her determination, her refusal to let anything stand in her way, had captivated him. He couldn't ignore the fact that his own action, one he had viewed as minor, had become a pivotal moment in her life. What if the fine had pushed her toward something greater? What if it had made her stronger, driven her to prove everyone wrong? It was a thought that both disturbed and intrigued him. In the quiet of his office late one evening as he sat at his desk, Frank stared at a picture of the Olympic Games on his wall. He thought about how much Maya had accomplished in the short time since the fine, how her name was now associated with the kind of triumph most people only dreamed of. He thought about the way she had taken control of her life, how she had refused to be defined by the limits imposed on her. It was then that Frank realized he needed to make things right. He had been a part of the system that had almost overlooked Maya's potential. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could offer something more than just an apology. He could do what he had never done before, acknowledge his own mistake, and recognize Maya's strength in a public way. The next day, Frank reached out to Maya, asking if they could meet. His mind was made up. He didn't know how it would be received, but he knew he had to make amends. He owed her that much, and perhaps in doing so, he could start to make peace with the choice that had inadvertently shaped her destiny. Maya had been busy, as usual, training before dawn, working long shifts at the law office, and squeezing in just enough sleep to get through the next day. But when her phone rang one quiet afternoon, the last person she expected to hear from was Judge Frank Mitchell. She stared at the name on the screen, unsure of what to expect. Since the article about her Olympic ambitions had been published, many people had reached out, some offering support, others asking for interviews or simply wishing her luck. But this call, from the man who had handed down her speeding fine, felt different. Taking a deep breath, Maya answered. "Hello." "Maya." Judge Mitchell's voice came through, warm but tentative. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Maya was taken aback. "No, it's fine. How can I help you?" "I'd like to meet with you, if you have a moment." "I've been thinking a lot about things," he said, his voice trailing off, as though unsure how to phrase what he wanted to say. Maya hesitated. She had no idea what this could be about. The fine seemed like a distant memory to her now, just another minor hurdle in a much bigger race. Still, something in his tone made her agree. "All right, when and where?" "How about the cafe on Main Street? Around 3 this afternoon," Frank suggested. Maya agreed, though a knot of curiosity formed in her stomach. She had no idea what Frank Mitchell wanted from her. They weren't exactly close, and aside from the fine, their interactions had been minimal. But if nothing else, it might provide an interesting twist in her already unconventional journey. By the time the clock struck 3, Maya arrived at the cafe, her heart pounding with uncertainty. She spotted Frank right away. He was seated at a small table near the window, his hands folded in front of him, his expression a mixture of nervousness and resolve. He stood as she approached, offering a stiff but respectful handshake. "Thank you for meeting me," Frank said. "I appreciate it." "Of course," Maya replied, taking a seat across from him. "You mentioned you wanted to talk. What's on your mind?" For a moment, Frank struggled to find the right words. He had been over this conversation in his mind countless times, but now that it was real, he wasn't sure how to begin. Finally, he said, "I've been thinking about the fine I gave you, and about how things have turned out since then." Maya blinked, not entirely sure where this was going. "Okay. I've been reading about you, about your training, your journey to the Olympic trials. And I realized something." Frank continued, leaning forward. "I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've always thought I was simply upholding the law. But your story has made me reconsider. I've realized that there are times when the law isn't the full story. Sometimes, what really matters is what happens after the law has been applied. And in your case, it seems that fine. Well, it became a turning point for you, in a way I never could have anticipated." Maya listened, surprised by his sincerity. "I didn't really think much of it," she said slowly. "It was just a small fine. I don't hold it against you." Frank nodded, but there was a trace of guilt in his eyes. "That's just it," he said. "I never saw you as anything more than a local woman who made a mistake. I never took the time to consider who you really were. But now I see that I was wrong about you. You're doing something incredible, something far beyond what I could have imagined. And I want to say, I'm sorry if I ever made you feel less than you are." Maya paused, absorbing his words. She hadn't expected an apology, let alone this kind of reflection. She had never held the fine against him. It had been a small inconvenience in the grand scheme of her life. But hearing him acknowledge her strength, her determination, made her appreciate the moment. "You don't need to apologize, Frank," Maya said, her voice steady. "I don't think of it as something bad. If anything, it made me more determined to show everyone who I really am. It's funny, isn't it? How something so small can change everything." Frank smiled, his face softening. "I suppose that's true. I just wanted to let you know that, in my eyes, you're more than just a story. You're a champion in the making." Maya smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of gratitude she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the recognition of her journey, of the obstacles she had overcome, and the ones still ahead. It was a reminder that sometimes, Even those who didn't understand your path could still come to respect it. I appreciate that, Frank. I really do, Maya said, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. And I'll keep running, for both of us. They sat for a while longer, discussing the trials, the journey, and the paths they had taken. Two very different people who, in that moment, understood each other a little more than before. Maya's life, once a routine of quiet ambition, was now filled with excitement and anticipation. The story about her journey to the Olympic trials had not only gained the attention of her town, but had spread far beyond Oak Ridge. Her inbox was filled with messages of support from strangers, other athletes, and coaches who had taken notice of her potential. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. The quiet woman, who had always been known for her humility, was now on the verge of something greater, and she wasn't about to let anything stop her. In the weeks following her conversation with Judge Mitchell, Maya's training had intensified. She woke up earlier, ran harder, and pushed her body beyond the limits she thought possible. The Olympic trials were drawing near, and she knew that this was her one chance to prove to the world, and to herself, that she belonged at the highest level of competition. She couldn't afford to hold back, not now. Every lap, every sprint, every muscle ache was a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place. Her training routine was demanding. Maya would start with long-distance runs, pushing herself to build endurance. Then, she would switch to sprint intervals, focusing on speed and agility. Afterward, she would hit the gym, lifting weights to strengthen her legs and core. Each day was a battle against exhaustion, but she never wavered. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. The pressure of the upcoming trials weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had never been this close to something so monumental, and the idea of failing was almost too much to bear. Yet, whenever those thoughts surfaced, she reminded herself of why she had started running in the first place. It wasn't for fame or glory. It was for the pure love of the sport, for the feeling of freedom she experienced every time her feet hit the track. She ran because it made her feel alive, because it was the only way she could truly challenge herself. Despite the intensity of her training, Maya remained grounded. She had learned over the years to keep her focus inward, not allowing the noise of the world to distract her from her goals. She had always kept her journey a secret, and now, with the world watching, she had to stay true to herself. She wasn't doing this for the headlines or for the people who doubted her. She was doing it for the little girl who had dreamed of running on the biggest stage, for the woman who had fought through every setback to get here. As the day of the Olympic trials approached, Maya found herself at a crossroads. The pressure was mounting, but so was the excitement. She had come too far to turn back now. With the encouragement of her family, friends, and even the judge who had once fined her, she knew that she had nothing to prove to anyone but herself. She wasn't just chasing a dream. She was creating her own reality, one step at a time. On the morning of the trials, Maya stood at the starting line, her heart pounding in her chest. The crowd was alive with energy, the air thick with anticipation. As the starter's pistol went off, Maya surged forward, her body moving instinctively. She wasn't thinking about the past, the doubt, or the pressure. She was thinking only of the finish line, of the dream that had driven her for years. With each stride, she felt the weight of Oak Ridge behind her, the hopes of a town that had once doubted her now resting on her shoulders. But Maya wasn't just running for them. She was running for herself, for the woman she had become. And in that moment, as her legs powered her down the track, she knew that no matter the outcome, this was just the beginning of something far greater. Maya's legs burned as she pushed herself toward the finish line. The rhythmic pounding of her feet on the track seemed to sync with the beating of her heart, and in that moment, she felt more alive than ever before. The world around her faded into a blur as her body surged forward, focused only on the finish line that was now within reach. She could hear the roar of the crowd, the sounds of encouragement and excitement echoing through the stadium, but it was as if they were distant, like a whisper in her mind. All that mattered was the track and the goal she had been chasing for so long. With a final burst of energy, Maya crossed the finish line, her chest heaving as she slowed to a stop. For a few seconds, she stood there, almost unsure of what had just happened. The crowd erupted in cheers, but it took a moment for the realization to settle in. She had done it. She had qualified for the Olympic trials. As she caught her breath, Maya glanced around, spotting her family and friends in the stands. They were on their feet, cheering wildly, their faces filled with pride and disbelief. David Carter, the reporter who had uncovered her story, was in the front row, his eyes wide with excitement. Judge Mitchell, who had reached out to her in the past, stood with a smile, applauding her achievement. For a brief moment, Maya let herself savor the realization that she had not only overcome the odds but had done so with grace and determination. The event organizers rushed over to congratulate her, but Maya remained composed, her smile modest. This moment wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the journey, the countless hours of training, the sacrifices she had made to get to this point. The triumph wasn't just in the race she had just run. It was in every early morning, every drop of sweat, every moment of doubt she had pushed through to make this dream a reality. Maya had once kept her dream a secret, believing that no one would take her seriously, that a woman from a small town with no big backing could never achieve something as grand as the Olympics. But now, standing on the verge of the biggest moment of her life, she understood something that no one could have told her before. Dreams weren't about waiting for permission or validation. Dreams were about believing in yourself and putting in the work, regardless of who else believed in you. The press flooded her with questions, but Maya answered them with the same calm confidence she had always carried. She spoke about the journey, the challenges, and how grateful she was for the support of her family, friends, and even those who had doubted her along the way. It wasn't just her victory. It was a collective one, a triumph of community, perseverance, and belief. As the day wore on, and Maya's achievements sank in, her phone buzzed with messages from all over the world. People who had followed her journey, who had cheered for her success. But the one message that stood out the most came from Judge Mitchell, who had sent a simple text. "You've made us all proud, Maya. I hope you know that you didn't just run for yourself. You ran for everyone who's ever been underestimated. And you proved us all wrong." Maya smiled at the words, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. The road had been long, and the obstacles had been many, but this was the moment she had worked for. And though the journey wasn't over yet, the Olympic trials were just the beginning. Maya Jackson, the woman who had once been invisible in her small town, was now a symbol of perseverance, strength, and the power of believing in oneself. And no matter what came next, she knew one thing for certain. She had already won.